Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are talking about obituaries. Now we're going to talk about two specific obituary collections or databases on Ancestry.com, but I want to start out with just a little bit of obituary 101 information that'll apply to anybody, and that is regardless of what country you live in, regardless of what time period you're looking for those obituaries in, just some basic information. Then we're going to talk about these two specific databases, the United States Obituary Collection and the Obituary Times Daily Index, which covers more than just the United States. So let's go ahead and dive in with just some basic information about obituaries, or at least how to work with obituaries. The first thing you need to be aware of is that obituaries may have been published in a variety of newspapers, and it might not always be exactly where you expect the obituary to have been published. Now, clearly, we're most familiar with obituaries being published in the place where the deceased lived, particularly if it's a local paper. Now, if they live in a suburb to a larger city, it might also be published in the larger city newspaper. It may be published where they died, so if they died somewhere other than their usual residence. It may also be published in a place where they grew up. So if they lived most of their life in a specific location and then moved later in their life, there may be an obituary published in the hometown newspaper. And then finally, you might find an obituary published in a place where their family members lived. So if they had children or grandchildren even, who all settled in a particular location, or who may have been prominent in a specific location, then they may publish an obituary there to notify the community that the parent or grandparent of this person in their community has passed away. So certainly just be aware that obituaries, again, they're not always going to be published maybe exactly where you expect, and they may be published in multiple locations. Which brings me to my next point, which is you're going to want to investigate or read all versions of that obituary. Every newspaper has a little bit different rules about how, when, and where obituaries can be published. Some newspapers charge for that, some charge by the word. Some newspapers just run what they have space available to run on any given day. So all the rules differ based on the newspaper, which means that if the family wrote an obituary, the newspaper has the right to edit that obituary down to whatever will fit their space or their cost restrictions. And so the more versions of the obituary that you obtain, the more likely you are to obtain the most complete set of information. Also, not just from different newspapers, but you're going to want to investigate all versions of the obituary when they're published over successive days. I know in the local newspapers here, oftentimes obituaries will be printed 2 or 3 days in a row, or they'll be printed once and then printed again the day before the funeral, which can sometimes be a week or even 2 weeks apart, depending on how long it takes the family members together. So you're going to want to investigate all of the versions of the obituary published in a single newspaper as well. And here's the reason why that's important. Very often an obituary will run in the newspaper, and of course the family is very interested in reading that, and sometimes they'll catch errors, a relationship that was listed incorrectly, a name that was spelled wrong, some information a date that was wrong, and they'll call the newspaper and correct that so that then when the obituary runs the next day, it's running with the corrected information. So again, investigate all versions of the obituary regardless of which newspaper or on successive days in a single newspaper. And then for those of you who are, and again, this applies if you're looking at newspapers published in the 1880s or newspapers published last week, right? You're going to want to review that obituary really carefully. I know sometimes we go looking for obituaries just to prove birth dates or death dates or parent information, but pay attention to the names of the spouses and the children and the in-laws and the grandchildren, anybody that's listed. You're going to want to review all the relationships that are listed in that obituary. And if you're looking for living family members, always make note of that residence of those living people, or the people who are the people who outlived the deceased, right? Because they may not be still living now, is what I'm saying. So they might be the people who are living still at the time of the obituary. Take a note of that. And one of the things that I do actually is in Family Tree Maker, in the notes section, I'll actually go in on every person listed in the obituary and make a note. I'll put the year. So for example, if it's a 2006 obituary, I'll put 2006, and then I'll write, still living according to his maternal grandmother's obituary, so that I know that they were mentioned in the obituary and that they lived past that date. If it lists where they lived, I will make a note of that, because very often then I'll go into the Public Records Index or even onto Facebook and start looking for some of these living people to connect with to see if they have more information about the family. And so putting it into my notes in Family Tree Maker just keeps it all in one handy place so that I can have that information available to me when I go looking for these living people and not have to keep going back and rereading and redigesting that particular obituary. So that's just some basic obituary 101 kinds of information. Let's talk about these two specific databases on Ancestry.com. The first one is the United States Obituary Collection. Now, we do have several obituary collections, but we're going to use the United States Obituary Collection as an example to just kind of show you what's happening here. If you're in Canada, there's some other options there. There's a database available for you as well. So I'm going to just hover over search here, come down here and click on the card catalog. Let me make this screen a little bit bigger so that you can see it. Over here in the title field, I'm just going to type in the word obituary and click search, and you're going to see that the United States Obituary Collection is the very first thing that comes up. 28 million records in this collection. Now, I'm just going to point out we also have a Canadian obituary collection, a UK and Ireland obituary collection, an Australia and New Zealand obituary collection. Those are a little bit smaller. For a couple of reasons. One is because they're smaller countries with less population. The other is because these obituaries are crawled or electronically obtained from any newspaper that publishes these obituaries online. And so some of these other countries, not as many newspapers either exist or put that information online. Whereas here in the United States, that's a really common practice. So let's take a look at this United States Obituary Collection. I'm going to open it here in a new tab so that we can come back to that index in the card catalog there in just a minute. So I'm going to have a search box, okay, and I can do some searches here. Let me just tell you a little bit about this collection before I do the first search. First of all, Ancestry.com started acquiring these obituaries for this collection in 2003, the latter part of 2003. So if I was to come in here, for example, and do a search on 2003, nothing else, you're going to see that there are a little more than 500,000, looks like 643,000 obituaries for the death date of 2003. Now then, if I go to 2004, you're going to notice that jumps, that number jumps quite a bit. We end up with 3 million, and then we end up with a fairly consistent several million every year since 2004. Now, with that said, there are still a few obituaries that date back prior to that. So if I put in the year 1990, for example, I've got 7,800 obituaries. A lot smaller number, but just because this database started in 2003 is when Ancestry.com started going out and connecting with these electronic newspapers that were publishing obituaries online and importing that information from that obituary into our database. Some newspapers have put archived or historical obituaries online, and we've been able to grab a few of those. So you will see a few before 2003, but the bulk of them are going to be 2003 and later. And these go all the way up to current. If I put in 2014, you'll see already for this year we have 400,000. I can even narrow it down specifically to just May of this year. We're only at the 20th of May. It looks like we've already managed to crawl or to obtain 7,100 obituaries that have run in U.S. newspapers since the 1st of May. So that's just kind of an understanding of the scope of the collection. And you'll notice the way I did that search, I do stuff like that all the time whenever I'm looking at a new database, because I want to get a feel for or an understanding of exactly what's in the database before I start searching it for my people. Okay, if I was looking for an obituary in 2001, what I just did would have helped me understand that it's probably not going to be there. And so those kinds of searches where you just do a quick name or rather a quick date search on a specific year or a specific state or location-based search only with no names really are a good way to get to know some of these databases before you start searching them. It'll make your searches a lot more successful. I think I've mentioned this, but I just want to make sure that this is clear. Ancestry.com does not create this information. We do not have copies of the original obituaries. All we do is we get an electronic feed into a predetermined set of fields from hundreds of online newspapers every day. And so we plug that information into the appropriate fields, but we don't actually house or hold the original copy of the obituary. So let me just show you what those fields look like. Let me clear my search form here of that date information that I had entered. And then let me just enter a name up here. I'm going to enter my last name just to see what happens. Go ahead and click search. Looks like there's 13,000 people with my last name, and you'll see there is some basic information here in the search results. Of course, if you click on view record, you're going to get the more complete set of index information. Okay, let me just explain what we're looking at here. First of all, we have the name of the deceased. And then in this case, there's a name in parentheses underneath. The reason we're able to do that is because her parents are identified in this particular obituary. So her father's name is listed in the obituary as well as her spouse's name. So we then surmise that this is her maiden name. And so we're able to display both, which means people could search for her as Lorene Clark, or they could search for her as Lorene Cowan, and they would still find this record. And we all know when we're doing genealogy, sometimes we come at it from the direction of trying to work backwards in time to discover the maiden name, and sometimes we come at it coming forward where we know the maiden name and we're trying to figure out who she married and what her name changed to. So we want people to be able to find this record either direction. So where we can, we include both the married name and the maiden name so that it will come up in search results either way. Now, we've got a gender where we're able to, to determine that electronically. An age at death, death date, the date the obituary was published. Now, remember, that's an important date because you want to look at obituaries from successive days to make sure that no corrections were made in the newspaper to that particular obituary. The title of the newspaper, in this case it's the Huntsville Daily, the location of that newspaper, again, where we can determine it or where that information is fed to us. In this case, there's a birth date listed, a residence at time of death, then, as I mentioned earlier, her spouse's name, her father's name, her mother's name, and then there's some children, some name of children or other people mentioned in this particular obituary. And in this case, they even listed the number of grandchildren and the number of great-grandchildren. So that's the kind of information that we are pulling electronically into this form. Now, this is a really clean, pretty example. Okay, they're not always so clean. Obituaries are not always written in the exact same language or in the exact, and by that I mean they're not always written in some kind of a templated format. So sometimes the information is really hard for a computer to read and understand which pieces of information need to get fed electronically into which fields. And so sometimes that gets a little bit off. That's okay. You found the record, or the point is this is an index, and the purpose of the index is to get you to the original record. So don't get too hung up on that. Again, it's an electronic feed into some of those predetermined fields. Another thing you need to be aware of is that some newspapers, particularly those that are published online, are conglomerates or large corporations who may own 10 or 20 or 30 different local newspapers. And what they sometimes do is they'll roll those obituary collections from all of those local newspapers into one web page. And that one web page may have a header for just one of those newspapers. And so sometimes the newspaper location may not be what you're expecting. This person may have died in Georgia. The obituary may have originally run in a printed Georgia newspaper, but when it got online, it went into a database for a newspaper conglomerate out of Texas. So just be aware that the location might not always match what you're expecting. So you're going to want to pay attention to some of those other locations like residence at time of death. I don't know where Woodville is. I'm assuming that it's near Alabama, near Huntsville, Alabama, but it might not be. And so you need to be a little bit familiar with the family, or again, just make sure you go read that original record. And so that's then my final word of advice for this particular collection is don't stop at that indexed record. Always, and this is true for any record you're viewing in genealogy, always do what you can to get back to the original. Don't just stop at this index page. In the case of the United States Obituary Collection, right up here, next to the name, you're going to see a little link that says View Full Obituary. If you click that, it's going to take you out to the location on the internet where that obituary was originally published. So in this case, here is the obituary for Lorene Clark. It has her birth and death dates. It has the information about which newspaper and what date this was originally published. And then here is the full text of that particular obituary. Another reason that you'll want to do that is because sometimes there's a photograph. Sometimes there's additional information in that particular obituary. And then, of course, because now you're at the newspaper's website, you can just double check to see if an obituary was published later. Now, with the case of electronic obituaries, very often all that's published online is the latest or most correct version of the obituary. It's usually just the newspaper or the printed versions of the obituary that get updated if there are errors. So just double check that date and see if it's the latest version of that particular obituary available, but electronically it's almost always going to be the most correct, or meaning no changes were made after this particular obituary was published. Now, one of the things that you need to be aware of is that this is a cached website. If you look up here in the URL, you're going to notice that this is actually you're still on Ancestry.com, and you're actually viewing a cached version of this particular web page when we first found it. Excuse me. So if you want to view the live web page, you're usually going to see a little link right underneath the URL box that'll take you to the live web page for that particular newspaper. I would encourage you to do that for a couple of reasons. One is because this, as I mentioned, then allows you to search the obituaries in this particular newspaper. So if I know that I have family that lives here in Huntsville, maybe I just want to come to their obituary section and search these obituaries for myself to see what other family members might be listed there. The other reason you might notice here, it looks a little different than the cached version. Sometimes it's a little cleaner to read, but the other thing is sometimes there is a guest book. In this case, there are 2 entries in a guest book for this particular person, and maybe those comments or those people who are leaving that information are other family members, and so it allows you to connect with them or to get their information. So always look to view that live web page. Now, with that said, sometimes the live web page is no longer in existence. Some newspapers, like the one that we were just looking at, that guest book was no longer available, probably because this woman has been deceased for 5 years now. And so sometimes they have a time limit on how long they'll leave those guest books open or how long they'll even leave the web page itself up. Now, some newspapers are getting better at it, and they're putting more and leaving more and more of that archived obituary history online, but some scrub the information off the internet within just a couple of years. So if the cached version isn't working, check for that live web page, but sometimes be aware that that live web page might not work either. And so in that case, what you need to do is just make a note of the obituary date and newspaper so that you know where to go to obtain the original from the printed newspaper, which brings me to our next database. So let's talk about the Obituary Times Daily Index for just a moment. Let me close out of this. It takes us right back to our card catalog. You're going to notice that the Obituary Daily Times Index is the second database on this list when you do a search in the card catalog for obituaries. It's got 15.6 million records in this one database. Covers the time period from 1995 to 2012. Now, there is a little something different that you may have noticed about the title of this database. Ancestry.com actually has quite a few databases on our website that have this prefix, and that is web. You'll see this little web with a semicolon or with a colon and then the name of the database. What that means is that this database is available electronically somewhere on the internet. And rather than you having to scour the internet for all of these different databases, Ancestry.com has created a web link to that particular database wherever it resides online. Those of you who've been using our Find a Grave, doing Find a Grave searches through Ancestry.com may have also noticed this web prefix. So Find a Grave is a database elsewhere on the internet, and we just provide you the ability to search those records through Ancestry.com. So in this case, we've done the same thing with this Obituary Times Daily Index. Now let me explain to you a little bit about how this came into being. Some of you may be familiar with rootsweb.com. Rootsweb.com is one of the largest free internet resources for family history. It's been around for years. Ancestry.com acquired it, probably about 12 years ago, and it continues to be free. It's still available, still out there for free. And a lot of the content, a lot of the records available on RootsWeb have been compiled by volunteers. It's a volunteer-run website. And so even though Ancestry.com hosts and pays for the servers and all the computer technology that keeps it running, the content that gets put online there is done by volunteers, and so it remains free. Now, this particular database, the Obituary Daily Times Index, it was originally a mailing list. So you know how you used to sign up for, some of you may still do this, sign up for mailing lists, and then you get an email every time somebody posts to that mailing list, or you can sign up for a digest version and just get one email a day. This was originally a mailing list sent out twice a day, and it was compiled by contributors who they each signed up for specific regions or specific newspapers. Every day they would go through their local newspaper and they would create an index of every obituary listed in that local newspaper that day. Now remember, this started back in 1995. The internet was still a very, very new thing. Most newspapers did not have online obituaries. So these volunteers were going through their local physical print copy of the newspaper, creating a little spreadsheet index of all the obituaries, submitting that to this RootsWeb group or mailing list. And then the deal was they had to hold on to that copy of the newspaper for 90 days so that anybody who got this mailing list and wanted a copy of the full obituary could respond to this mailing list and get a copy of that obituary sent to them. So that database was created for the purpose of kind of this real-time or 90-day time period access to obituaries from all over the world, anywhere volunteers had signed up to be responsible for specific newspapers or specific newspaper titles. So the Obituary Times Daily Index, or Daily Times Index, has obituaries from not just the United States, but Canada and England and Ireland. I think there's some in there from Germany and France, just anywhere volunteers agreed to participate in this particular mailing list. Now, of course, because this ended, or the database ends in 2012, that's much more than 90 days out. And so when you find an entry, there is nobody to contact, no volunteer to contact to get a copy of this particular obituary. So let me just show you what one of these entries looks like. So this is, again, I just did a search for my last name, but this is for Elizabeth Cowan. And she was 91 years old when she died, and it has a birth date and a death date, and then a publication date when that particular obituary was published. And then you'll notice instead of a go to obituary, you have go to website. You may see this again anytime there is the word web in front of a database title on Ancestry. You're probably going to see this. And the purpose of that notification and this one is that we are going to open up another window. We're going to take you somewhere else on the internet. In this case, we're taking you out to the original Obituary Daily Times Index on RootsWeb, where you can look through to locate the record that you're interested in. So I can come here, for example, let's make this a little larger. Okay. I can come out here and I can find the record of interest, and it's going to tell me some things here. So let's just look at this one. Cowan, her name is Barbara Elizabeth. She went by Babs. She was 82 years old when she died. She was probably, I think this likely means she was born in Yorkshire, England, died in Pacific Grove, California, and her obituary ran in the Monterey Herald on January 7th, 2003. And then this is the username of the person who submitted the obituary to this original index. So that's what that all means. Now, here's the deal, though. This is from 2003, and there is no link to take me to the Monterey Herald in 2003 to see an electronic copy of this obituary. Remember, these were people with print newspapers who held on to them for 90 days to respond to email queries when this list was originally created. So how do you get access to this record now? Well, there are a couple of things I do. The first thing I do is if you highlight the name of the newspaper, and I use Google Chrome, and one of the reasons I do is for this very purpose right here. If you highlight the name of the newspaper and then right-click, you can search Google for the Monterey Herald. And so it automatically takes me to another Google search where it's already filled it in for me. And here is the Monterey Herald online. And they even have a section specifically for obituaries in the search results. And so I can click that, and that will take me to their obituary page. Okay, so this is their obituary page for today. Now, if I come up here, you'll see today's obituaries or memorial sites. Those are the only two options online for the Monterey Herald. There's nothing that says archived or search old obituaries, and that's the kind of language you're going to want to look for. For some of these websites that have old obituaries online, that's how you're going to have to access them, is through some kind of a search archived obituaries link. So if I just click on this, I can search some of them, but you'll notice here it gives me just a really limited options here for searching. I've actually tried searching for this obituary back in 2003, and it's not available online. So look for a little search box where you can find it to see. If it's a recent obituary, it's usually going to be right here, but if it's an old obituary, you're going to have to do a more specific or more broad, actually, time-based search. I can come here and click on date range. That's going to allow me to put in whatever date I want here to see if there is an obituary that is that old, okay? And like I said, I did the search, and in this case, there's not. So then what is my next step? Okay, so we first locate the online archive to see if it's available online. In this case, it's not, so what am I going to do? Well, one of my favorite groups of people on the planet are librarians. I have actually never met a librarian that I just didn't adore. They're full of information, and they love sharing that information. And so very often, I would, like on that Monterey Herald page, copy down the information about the newspaper itself, make sure I've got the title correct, make sure I've got the right location, then do a Google search for the Monterey Library. Call the library very often, and a phone call sometimes is better than an email. So I'll call the library and let them know that I'm looking for an obituary from a 2003 edition of their local newspaper. Sometimes they'll have that available in actual paper form, and so it might take them a little bit of time to go back into their stacks and pull the big, they'll put the old newspapers in giant bound books. They'll have to go pull that, and sometimes they will. Sometimes they'll do it with me waiting on the phone, depending on how large their library is or how busy they are or are not. They'll go pull that and sometimes just read it to me right over the phone, which is delightful. Sometimes they'll take down my email address, and by the end of the day, I'll have a scanned copy of the obituary in my email. Sometimes they'll tell me that I can go onto their website and fill out a little form, and it might cost me $2, $3, or $4 to send that to them, and then I get a copy of it, a Xerox copy of it in the mail. So every library handles it a little bit differently. But I have never talked to a library who had the newspaper available who wasn't willing to help me in one way or another. And so always work with the local library. You're going to have much more success than contacting the newspaper. I've tried that a few times, and that has been less than successful for me. But the local library almost always has copies of the local newspapers and almost always has somebody who is willing and available to help you fairly quickly. So again, you're just going to make note of the title of the newspaper and see that you contact the local library in that particular location in order to get a copy of that specific obituary. And then make sure again that you digest all of the information in it, that you copy down all of the family members, that you make sure you understand all of those relationships, because those relationships and that information about where those people were living is what's going to lead you to the next generation in your search for that family. Hopefully this was useful and helpful information. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.